The gentle clink of fine china and soft murmur of conversations filled the air at Le Blanc's, one of Chicago's most prestigious restaurants. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the cream-colored walls, while white tablecloths draped elegantly across each table. It was just another busy lunch service, but for Maya Chen, it was another step toward her dreams. At 26, Maya wasn't just any waitress. Behind her perfectly pressed black uniform and polite smile lay the determination of someone who had spent countless nights studying medical textbooks. Working at Le Blanc wasn't her end goal. It was the bridge that helped her pay for medical school and support her mother back home. The restaurant's manager, Mr. Rodriguez, had always admired Maya's work ethic. He'd seen her arrive early each morning, reviewing her medical notes before her shift started, and staying late to help close up even after a grueling day. Maya's got something special, he'd often tell the other staff members. Mark my words, one day we'll all be making appointments to see Dr. Chen. That particular Tuesday afternoon, Maya moved gracefully between tables, refilling water glasses and taking orders with a warmth that made even the most demanding guests smile. She had mastered the art of balancing multiple plates while mentally reciting the stages of cellular division, a skill that never failed to amuse her younger coworkers. "How do you do it?" asked Lily, a newer waitress, watching Maya effortlessly handle a table of demanding business executives. "You never seem to get rattled, even when people are being difficult." Maya adjusted her name tag and smiled. "Every experience is a learning opportunity," she replied, thinking of her future career as a doctor. Besides, treating people with kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything. The lunch rush was in full swing when Mr. Rodriguez called Maya over. "Table 12 just got seated," he said, gesturing toward the window section. "It's Mrs. Howard and her friends. They're particular about their service." His expression said what his words didn't. This group was notorious for their treatment of staff. Maya nodded confidently. She'd handled challenging customers before, and nothing could shake her professional demeanor. After all, she'd faced tougher situations during her hospital rotations. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her apron and grabbed her notepad, ready to provide the same excellent service she offered every guest. What Maya didn't know was that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. As she approached table 12, she couldn't have guessed that the next few hours would test not just her patience and professionalism, but would ultimately change the course of her career in ways she never imagined. The sunlight streaming through Le Blanc's floor-to-ceiling windows caught the expensive jewelry adorning Mrs. Howard's wrists, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloth. Maya put on her warmest smile, unaware that she was walking into a situation that would soon have the entire restaurant watching in disbelief. Behind her, a distinguished-looking gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit was being seated at the adjacent table. He opened his menu quietly, but his eyes weren't focused on the lunch specials. Instead, he observed the scene about to unfold with growing interest, his presence unnoticed by everyone except Mr. Rodriguez, who recognized him immediately as one of the city's most influential medical professionals. Mrs. Howard's arrival at Le Blanc always commanded attention, though not for the reasons she might have hoped. The clicking of her designer heels against the marble floor announced her presence before she even reached her regular table. Today, she wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than Maya's entire semester's tuition, her neck draped with pearls that gleamed under the restaurant's elegant lighting. "Ladies, isn't this just perfect?" Mrs. Howard gestured to her three companions as they settled into their seats. "Though I must say, the standards here aren't quite what they used to be." She cast a dismissive glance around the dining room, her eyes barely acknowledging Maya's presence as she approached with menus. "Good afternoon, welcome to Le Blanc." Maya greeted them with her characteristic warmth. "May I start you ladies with some beverages? Perhaps our house-made sparkling water with fresh mint?" Mrs. Howard cut her off mid-sentence. "Well, at least they sent someone this time," she said loudly to her friends, acting as if Maya wasn't standing right there. "Last time we waited 10 whole minutes before anyone even noticed us. Can you imagine?" Maya maintained her professional smile, though her fingers tightened slightly around her notepad. "I apologize if you've had any unsatisfactory experiences. I'll ensure your lunch today is perfect." "Perfect." Mrs. Howard's perfectly plucked eyebrows arched upward. "Dear, do you even know how to serve at a restaurant of this caliber? This isn't some quick-service establishment." The other diners nearby began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some lowering their voices or pretending to be deeply absorbed in their menus. At the next table, the distinguished gentleman in the suit slowly placed his menu down, his attention now fully focused on the unfolding scene. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm well trained in fine dining service," Maya responded politely, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. 6 years of working at LaPlante while pursuing her medical degree had taught her how to handle difficult situations with grace. Mrs. Howard's friends exchanged knowing looks as she ordered a bottle of the second most expensive wine on the menu, never the most expensive, as that would seem too obvious. "And make sure it's properly chilled this time," she added with a condescending wave of her hand. "I can't believe I have to explain these things." As Maya walked away to fetch their wine, she could hear Mrs. Howard's stage whisper carrying across the dining room, "Really, where do they find these people? In my day, fine dining meant something. The help knew their place." The restaurant's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as other diners tried to focus on their meals while stealing glances at table 12. Mr. Rodriguez watched from near the kitchen, his jaw clenched but knowing that intervening too soon might make things worse for Maya. When Maya returned with the wine, her hands were steady as she presented the bottle for approval. Years of practice in the medical lab had given her an almost surgical precision with such tasks. But Mrs. Howard wasn't interested in Maya's expertise or professionalism. "Oh, look at her trying to act sophisticated," Mrs. Howard commented to her friends, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Honey, do you even know what kind of wine this is? Can you even afford to shop at places that sell it?" Maya took a deep breath, remembering her mother's words. "Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond to that treatment." She began the wine service with perfect technique, her movements graceful and assured despite the growing hostility directed at her. At the adjacent table, the gentleman in the suit had stopped pretending to read his menu altogether. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left the scene unfolding before him. He seemed to be taking mental notes of every word, every gesture, and every response. Dr. Thomas Chen watched the scene unfold from his table, his expression carefully neutral despite his growing displeasure. As the newly appointed chief of surgery at Chicago Memorial Hospital, he had reviewed hundreds of medical school applications over the past month. One particular application had stood out. A brilliant student working her way through medical school as a waitress, with outstanding recommendations from her professors. Now, watching Maya handle Mrs. Howard's rudeness with grace and professionalism, he understood exactly why those recommendations had been so glowing. It was one thing to read about someone's character on paper, it was another to witness it being tested in real time. He took a small sip of water, remembering the interview from just last week. Maya had arrived early, her resume impeccable, her answers thoughtful and passionate. What had impressed him most wasn't just her perfect grades or her research experience. It was the way she spoke about patient care, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of their background. "The best doctors," she had said during the interview, "are the ones who remember that every patient is someone's loved one." Those words echoed in his mind now as he watched her maintain her composure under Mrs. Howard's constant barrage of thinly veiled insults. Another diner at his table, Dr. Patricia Wong, leaned over and whispered, "Isn't that the student you were telling me about? The one with the groundbreaking research proposal on community healthcare access?" Dr. Chen nodded slightly, his eyes still focused on the unfolding drama. "Top of her class," he murmured back. "Works here to support her mother and pay for medical school. She's already been accepted into our program, though she doesn't know it yet. The official letters go out next week." Mrs. Howard's voice carried across the restaurant again, making some crude remark about Maya's appearance. Dr. Chen's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his water glass. As someone who had faced his own share of prejudice during his early medical career, the scene stirred old memories. He watched as Maya efficiently managed multiple tables despite Mrs. Howard's attempts to fluster her. Every move was precise, every interaction professional. Even when bringing fresh bread to Mrs. Howard's table, she maintained perfect posture and a gentle smile despite the ongoing stream of backhanded comments. She has the temperament for emergency medicine, Dr. Wang observed quietly. Look at how she stays calm under pressure. That's not something you can teach. Dr. Chen agreed silently. In the high-stress environment of a hospital, keeping one's composure was as crucial as medical knowledge. Maya was demonstrating that skill right now, though in a very different arena. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mrs. Howard clearly thought she was dealing with just a waitress, someone she could freely disrespect. She had no idea that the young woman she was belittling would likely be treating patients at Chicago Memorial within a year, possibly even someone from her own social circle. He checked his watch, knowing he had a board meeting in an hour. But something told him he needed to stay. Years of emergency room experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him this situation was building toward a crisis point. A quick text to his assistant rescheduled his next meeting. Sometimes, being in the right place at the right time meant making difficult choices. As chief of surgery, he had learned that timing was everything, whether in the operating room or in life's more unexpected moments. Maya passed by his table again, refreshing water glasses with steady hands. Her eyes met his briefly, professional and composed, showing no sign that she recognized him from her interview. Dr. Chen gave her a small, encouraging nod, though he knew she wouldn't understand its full meaning. Not yet, anyway. Should we say something? Dr. Wang asked, her voice barely audible. But Dr. Chen shook his head slightly. He had seen enough of Maya's character to know she could handle herself. Besides, he had a feeling things were about to reach a turning point, and when they did, his words would carry more weight if he waited for the right moment. The lunch service continued, and Maya's arms were beginning to ache from carrying heavy plates while maintaining perfect posture. She had just finished serving the main course to Mrs. Howard's table, each dish placed with precision despite the constant stream of criticism about everything from the temperature of the food to the way Maya held the plates. "I suppose this is acceptable," Mrs. Howard said, examining her perfectly prepared salmon with obvious disdain. "Though I must say, the presentation was much better last time." She turned to her friends, speaking as if Maya wasn't there. "You know, I remember when this place had standards about who they hired. The whole atmosphere has changed." Maya focused on her breathing, just as she did during difficult medical procedures in her clinical rotations. In and out, steady and calm. She had dealt with challenging situations before, but something about today felt different. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension, like the atmosphere before a storm. Then it happened. As Maya carefully refilled water glasses at the table, Mrs. Howard made a sudden gesture with her hand, accidentally bumping Maya's arm. A few drops of water splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, leaving small dark spots on the fabric. The reaction was immediate and explosive. "Look what you've done!" Mrs. Howard's voice cut through the restaurant's gentle background music like a knife. "This is designer silk." She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is exactly what happens when you hire people who don't belong in establishments like this." The entire restaurant fell silent. Forks stopped mid-bite. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the soft piano music playing through the speakers seemed to fade away. "I am so sorry, ma'am," Maya said, quickly reaching for her service cloth. "Let me help clean that up for you." "Don't you dare touch anything else." Mrs. Howard's face had turned red with anger. "Do you have any idea how much this outfit costs?" "More than you probably make in a month." "I want to speak to your manager immediately." Mr. Rodriguez was already moving towards the table, but Mrs. Howard wasn't finished. She turned to address the entire restaurant now, as if seeking public support for her outrage. "This is what's wrong with society today. They let anyone work anywhere, and look what happens. In my day, people knew their place. They didn't try to pretend they belonged where they clearly don't." Maya stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. Years of practice keeping steady hands during medical procedures couldn't stop the slight trembling she felt now. A drop of water rolled down her cheek. She wasn't sure if it was from the water pitcher or something else. At nearby tables, other diners were showing visible signs of discomfort. Some looked down at their plates, others whispered in disapproval of Mrs. Howard's behavior. A couple at a corner table asked for their check, clearly wanting to leave the uncomfortable scene. Dr. Chen at the next table had put down his fork entirely, his face set in a stern expression as he watched the scene unfold. Dr. Wang beside him looked ready to stand up, but he placed a gentle hand on her arm, silently asking her to wait. "I want her fired," Mrs. Howard demanded, pointing a manicured finger at Maya. "I am a long-time customer here, and I refuse to be served by someone so completely incompetent." She turned to her friends for support. Really, what were they thinking hiring someone like her? You can tell just by looking that she doesn't belong here. Maya felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but she held her ground. She thought about her mother, who had taught her to face prejudice with dignity. She thought about her future patients, who would need her to stay calm in crisis situations. She would not let this moment break her. Mr. Rodriguez finally reached the table, his usual friendly demeanor replaced with professional seriousness. "Mrs. Howard, please lower your voice. I'm sure we can resolve this situation calmly." "Calmly? Look at my outfit. Look at this tablecloth. I demand action immediately. Either she goes or I take my business elsewhere, and I'll make sure everyone in my social circle knows exactly why." The threat hung in the air like heavy smoke. Maya closed her eyes briefly, thinking of her medical school tuition, her mother's medical bills, all the reasons she needed this job. But before anyone could speak, a chair scraped back at the next table, and a commanding voice cut through the tension. The sound of a chair slowly sliding back cut through the tense atmosphere. Dr. Chen rose from his table, straightening his suit jacket with deliberate calm. Every eye in the restaurant turned to him as he stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Mrs. Howard," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed restaurant. "I believe I should introduce myself. I'm Dr. Thomas Chen, Chief of Surgery at Chicago Memorial Hospital." Mrs. Howard's expression flickered with recognition. Her husband was on the hospital's board of directors, and Dr. Chen's name carried significant weight in their social circles. "Oh, Dr. Chen," she said, her tone suddenly honey-sweet. "I had no idea you were here. I'm sure you understand my frustration with the poor service." "Actually," Dr. Chen interrupted politely but firmly, "I've been observing everything for the past hour. And what I've seen is nothing short of exemplary service from Maya, despite being subjected to treatment that no human being should have to endure." Mrs. Howard's face paled slightly. You know this waitress?" "Indeed," Dr. Chen continued, taking another step forward. "Maya isn't just a waitress, though there's nothing wrong with being one. She's currently at the top of her class in medical school. In fact," he turned to address the restaurant at large, "you're all looking at one of the most promising future surgeons I've had the privilege of interviewing." A murmur rippled through the dining room. Mrs. Howard's friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some already gathering their purses, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the situation. "I don't understand," Mrs. Howard stammered. "Why would someone like that be working here?" Dr. Wang stood up now too, joining her colleague. "Someone like what exactly?" she asked, her voice sharp but professional. "Someone dedicated enough to work full-time while pursuing a medical degree. Someone professional enough to maintain perfect composure while being publicly humiliated." Maya stood perfectly still, her eyes wide with surprise. She recognized Dr. Chen now from her interview last week, but she hadn't expected him to be here, let alone defend her so publicly. "Maya has already been accepted into our surgical residency program," Dr. Chen continued. "Though she doesn't know that yet, the official letters haven't gone out." He smiled warmly at Maya, whose hands flew to her mouth in shock. "I was planning to tell you next week, but given the circumstances." The restaurant burst into spontaneous applause. Several diners stood up, joining in the celebration of Maya's achievement and Dr. Chen's intervention. Even the kitchen staff had peeked out to witness the scene. Mrs. Howard's face had turned from pale to bright red. I didn't know," she stumbled over her words. "That's precisely the point," Dr. Chen said firmly. "You didn't know, yet you felt entitled to judge and humiliate another human being. I wonder what your husband, who chairs our hospital's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, would think about this incident." Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mrs. Howard, I believe it would be best if you settled your bill and left, and I should inform you that your regular table will no longer be available to you. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who mistreats our staff. Mrs. Howard's friends were already standing, gathering their things, clearly embarrassed to be associated with her. One of them whispered something about being late for another appointment. Maya, Dr. Chen turned to her, his voice gentle. Would you join Dr. Wong and me for a moment? I believe we have some paperwork to discuss regarding your residency position. Maya nodded, still processing everything that had happened. As she walked toward their table, other diners reached out to touch her arm or whisper congratulations. The elderly couple in the corner dabbed at their eyes with their napkins, clearly moved by the turn of events. Behind them, Mrs. Howard was left standing alone at her table, her carefully constructed social facade crumbling as she realized the full impact of her actions in front of exactly the kind of people whose opinion she valued most. As Maya sat at Dr. Chen's table, the rest of the restaurant had returned to its usual gentle hum of conversation, though now peppered with excited whispers about what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Howard had left in a hurry, leaving behind a generous but guilt-ridden tip that Mr. Rodriguez immediately added to the staff's shared pool. I have to admit, Dr. Chen said, sliding a folder across the table, I wasn't planning to do this until next week, but sometimes moments choose themselves. He opened the folder to reveal official hospital letterhead. Your residency acceptance letter. You earned this, Maya. Your academic record is outstanding, but what I witnessed today, that kind of grace under pressure, that's something we can't teach. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the letter. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her eyes scanning the words that would change her life. Thank you for standing up for me. Most people just look away. Dr. Wong leaned forward. You know, Maya, what Mrs. Howard didn't realize is that she just showed everyone exactly why you'll be an exceptional doctor. You showed compassion to someone who showed you none. That's exactly what we look for in our medical staff. The elderly couple from the corner table stopped by on their way out. The woman gently touched Maya's shoulder. Dear, my husband was a doctor for 40 years, she said softly. And he always said the most important quality in a physician isn't just knowledge, it's humanity. You have that in spades. Mr. Rodriguez brought over a fresh pot of tea for their table, his face beaming with pride. Maya has been working here for 6 years, he told Dr. Chen and Dr. Wong. She started just after her mother got sick, never missed a shift, never complained, always helped train new staff, even took extra shifts to help cover others' medical emergencies. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. That reminds me, Mrs. Howard's husband sits on our hospital board. He's actually the head of our community outreach program. He paused, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. I have a board meeting this afternoon. I think he'll be very interested to hear about today's events. Maya's eyes widened. Oh, please don't make trouble on my account. It's not trouble, Dr. Wong interrupted gently. It's accountability. Besides, this incident highlights exactly why our hospital's diversity and inclusion initiatives are so crucial. Sometimes people need to see their own prejudices reflected back at them to understand their impact. A young waitress approached their table, nervously clutching her notepad. I'm sorry to interrupt, but, Maya, you're the reason I applied to pre-med, she confessed. Watching you study between shifts, never giving up on your dreams, it made me believe I could do it too. Maya reached out and squeezed the young woman's hand. You can. And when you're ready to apply to medical school, I'll write you the strongest letter of recommendation. Dr. Chen watched this exchange with approval. You see, Maya? Leadership isn't just about titles. You've been inspiring others all along, even when you thought you were just serving tables. Just then, Mr. Rodriguez hurried back to their table, his face concerned. Maya, your mother's on the phone. She sounds worried. Apparently Mrs. Howard's husband called her at home. But Dr. Chen raised his hand reassuringly. That would be my doing, actually. I asked him to. You see, Mrs. Howard's husband is also the chair of our hospital's Patient Financial Assistance Program. When I called to tell him about today's incident, he insisted on reviewing your mother's case personally. I believe he's calling to let her know that her remaining medical bills have been taken care of. Maya's eyes filled with tears. But why would he do that? Because, Dr. Wong explained gently, sometimes people need to make amends for the actions of their family members. And sometimes, What looks like the worst moment of your day can turn into the best thing that could have happened. The sunshine streaming through LeBlanc's windows seemed brighter somehow, catching the tears of joy in Maya's eyes as she realized that everything, her mother's health, her medical school debt, her future career, had all shifted dramatically in the space of one extraordinary lunch service. 3 months later, the story of what happened at LeBlanc had spread through Chicago's social circles like wildfire. Mrs. Howard's usual lunch companions had suddenly become too busy to join her. Her charity committee positions, once her pride and joy, had quietly been filled by others. It wasn't just about taking a stand against her behavior. No one wanted to risk being associated with someone who had publicly insulted a rising star in Chicago's medical community. Maya's last day at LeBlanc was a celebration unlike any other. Regular customers brought cards and small gifts. The kitchen staff prepared her favorite staff meal one last time. Mr. Rodriguez gave a speech that left everyone wiping their eyes, telling the story of a young woman who had started as a nervous waitress and was leaving as an inspiration to everyone who knew her. "You know what I'll miss most?" Maya told her co-workers as they gathered around her. "The way we all looked out for each other here. That's something I want to bring to medicine, the idea that we're all in this together." The elderly couple who had witnessed everything that day had become regulars, requesting Maya's section whenever they came in. On her last day, they handed her an envelope. Inside was a check, enough to cover her remaining medical school expenses. "We've been blessed in life," the woman explained, squeezing Maya's hand. "And we believe in investing in people who will make the world better. Just promise us one thing. When you're a successful doctor, remember there are other young people out there like you, needing someone to believe in them." Word of the incident had reached the hospital board, leading to significant changes. Mrs. Howard's husband, deeply embarrassed by his wife's behavior, had doubled the hospital's diversity scholarship fund. The story became a teaching point in the hospital's staff training programs about treating everyone with dignity and respect. Dr. Chen made sure the story followed Mrs. Howard in subtle ways. At charity events, people would whisper about how she had humiliated that brilliant young doctor. At hospital fundraisers, she found herself seated far from the important guests. Her social standing, built over decades, had crumbled in a single afternoon. But the most significant changes were happening at Chicago Memorial Hospital. Maya's story had inspired other staff members to share their experiences with discrimination. The hospital established new policies and training programs, ensuring that everyone, from patients to cleaning staff, was treated with respect. Maya's first day as a resident was filled with nervous excitement. As she walked through the hospital doors wearing her white coat for the first time, she remembered all the moments that had led to this: the long nights studying after double shifts, the weight of plates and dreams balanced carefully in her hands. Her first patient was an elderly woman who looked strikingly similar to Mrs. Howard. The woman was frightened, alone, and not particularly kind to the hospital staff. But Maya treated her with gentle compassion, remembering that everyone deserves dignity, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. At the end of her shift, Maya found a note in her locker from Dr. Chen. "Today, one of the nurses told me how kindly you treated a difficult patient. You didn't just learn medicine, you learned humanity. That's what makes a truly great doctor." The story became legend at LeBlanc. New staff members would hear about the waitress who became a doctor, how she handled discrimination with grace, and how karma had worked its magic that day. Mr. Rodriguez kept a small photo on his office wall, Maya in her white coat, smiling broadly, with a note, "Never forget where you came from or how you got to where you're going." And Mrs. Howard? She learned her lessons the hard way. Her social circle had shrunk, but more importantly, she had to live with the knowledge that her actions had revealed her true character to everyone who mattered in her world. Some said they saw her volunteering at a community clinic, trying to rebuild her reputation. Others noticed she had become quieter, more thoughtful in her interactions with service staff. Maya kept her promise to the elderly couple. She established a scholarship fund for service industry workers pursuing medical degrees. Every year, she would visit LeBlanc to talk to the staff about chasing their dreams, no matter what obstacles they faced. The restaurant itself had changed too. Mr. Rodriguez made sure every new employee heard Maya's story, not as gossip, but as a reminder that everyone deserves respect and that sometimes the person refilling your water glass might just be tomorrow's leading surgeon. As Maya drove home after her first month as a resident, she passed by Le Blanc. The lights were warm and inviting as always, and she could see the staff moving efficiently between tables. She smiled, knowing that sometimes life's hardest moments become the foundation for its greatest triumphs.